Hi, I'm Dr. Linda Mintle. Hey, thanks for listening to the Dr. Linda Mintle Show. Faith radio podcasts are only possible because of your support. Thanks for giving and for sharing with a friend.
Doing life together, reaching out with hope, encouraging one another, each step along the road. You and I can make everything a little better, doing life together.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Linda Mintle Show. I'm your host, Dr. Linda Mintle, the relationship doctor, and I'm here along with my co-host, the other Dr. Mintle, my husband, Norm. And every weekend, we're here, we're doing life together, and we're so glad you've joined us.
You know, I really hate to say this because I feel like I've said it so many times before, but the week goes pretty quickly sometimes, but the weekend is like you bat your eyes and it's over.
I think that's because we're trying to rest and relax and do other things.
And get everything done that you do.
Yeah, and then we're doing a radio show, we're doing other things, but it does feel good to have a little bit of a break, so that's nice.
Yeah, but so my question is, how do you feel? Are you feeling okay today? How are you? What? I just want to know how you feel. Isn't that, no?
Well, it's a little strange that you keep asking me that question, especially since we just talked before the show began, right? But I know why you're doing this. You're asking about my feelings because that is today's topic, right? We're going to talk about this on the show. And what we're going to talk about may really surprise you.
Well, that's what I think so, because it surprised me when we were doing the research for this episode. So let's get right to it. If you have young children, perhaps teens or grandchildren, you're really going to want to listen to this show. Actually, it applies to adults as well, don't you think?
It does. It does. And I think asking the question, though, to children especially, how do you feel? I mean, that's a pretty normal question, right?
I think so. We all say it.
We all say it. But we do that for we do that with our young adult daughter. We do that with a lot of the people in our lives that have meaningful relationships with us, right? Mm-hmm. But think about it. How many times have you heard or said, are you enjoying your ice cream? How do you feel at school today? Or when you played with your friend, how did you feel?
I don't know. I think because you're a psychologist, we've said that a lot in our lives because it seems like it's one of those terms, but we all do it now. We focus on how our child is feeling. And is there a problem with that? Isn't that healthy? Isn't that what we do? We check in?
Well, that's our discussion for today. And even being a psychologist, I think I knew this intuitively, what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to talk a little bit about this constant temperature checking or checking into their feelings and the emotions that they're experiencing, because it can bring some surprising results when you do that. If you keep asking a child, Norm, about their feeling moment by moment, right. Like you're constantly focusing on that. And that's really the key here, is that you're always asking them about how they feel. You're going to signal that child that his or her happiness is the main thing. It's the ultimate goal, to be happy.
Is it different to ask about feeling in the moment or just feeling in life?
I think what we're talking about is this whole idea that you have to be happy constantly. So the more we pursue this happiness as a life goal, I think the more disappointed people become because we're not happy all the time.
No.
Remember that Sunday school song we used to sing? In right, out right, up right, down right, happy all the time.
Right.
I remember singing that and thinking, I'm not.
Right.
I'm not happy all the time, even with Jesus.
I'm a bad
I'm not
Christian.
happy all the time, And so that need for this constant positivity is actually associated with lower psychological functioning.
Oh, why is that?
Well, because when we increase attention to those negative emotions that we're having, the more emotional distress we actually can create in people. There's some research to suggest, Norm, that even the more that kids actually, especially those kids that really struggle, and so you keep going after them and saying, how you doing? How are you feeling? The more you focus on their feelings, that focused attention becomes actually counterproductive. And that's because emotions can be manipulative. They can be manipulated as well. They can also change. And our feelings are often very unreliable.
Of course.
And they're not a good gauge for figuring out life and even how to respond in different situations. So we just can't be driven by our emotions.
That's really good. So let me get this. If we, by constantly questioning our children how they feel, are basically teaching them to rely on something that isn't valid or reliable, we're doing them a disfavor. Feelings come and go, they're fleeting, and maybe children need to be taught that.
Yeah, and I think that you're exactly on the right idea here, that we can see that if we emphasize that over maybe looking at something about how do you reason in a situation, how are you making your decisions based on your feelings? I mean, we don't want to do that as adults, right?
Right.
We don't want to be making decisions based on how I feel in the moment, because that isn't always a great thing. And I think we can just look around our culture and we can say there's a lot of people making decisions based on feelings. So let's just take, for example, one of my pet peeves here I'm going to talk about, which is these trigger warnings that have become so popular on college campuses and in teaching. They're really something we need to look at.
So just so everyone knows what we're talking about, a trigger warning is a statement that is made to prepare an audience, or students in this case, for materials or subjects that maybe they may find disturbing due to their life experiences and trauma. So in many universities in the settings where we work, professors have been called on the carpet because they didn't provide a trigger warning before saying something, presenting something to the class with content that turned out to be disturbing. So although no one is really certain what it is that might trigger a person, students have demanded that they be forewarned in class.
Yeah, so for example, I might be teaching a lecture, and I do teach a lecture on sexual assault, right? I have to teach that to medical students. They have to understand, they have to know how to recognize it, know what it is. And before I do, I might say, this would be an example of a trigger warning, the material I'm about to present may cause you to feel triggered or upset. I'm giving you a warning that this content could bring up disturbing feelings.
And again, just so people understand, forgetting to do this or not doing it at all has resulted in more than a few professors and teachers getting in trouble as students complained that they were very upset without warning.
Okay, so here's the interesting part of that. So I looked at the research on this, and there was a research group actually that decided to look at these trigger warnings. They were in Australia. It's a university called let's see, let me try to remember it. It's Flinders University. Have you ever heard of that university?
I have not.
I haven't either. But they reviewed 12 research papers on the topic of trigger warnings. Their conclusions, based on those findings and those studies that they looked at, was, get this, trigger warnings are neither helpful or harmful. And the lead investigator was quoted as saying, they don't seem to do anything. They didn't seem to reduce student distress or lead to avoidance of the materials. And this was true of students regardless, Norm, of whether they had past trauma in life or not. So to our point, trigger warnings could even bring more attention to negative feelings because you're predicting them and you're getting students to expect to feel bad. And guess what?
They do.
They do.
Yeah, of course. So in effect, a trigger warning serves more often to trigger the negative feelings because the professor focuses attention on the feelings that the student's going to have. Ironically, all this fuss and demand to not upset the feelings of students apparently actually leads for them to feel more upset, the very opposite of the intention.
It's just so interesting when I looked at that, and that's exactly right. You predict they'll feel bad, and guess what?
They do.
They do.
Yeah, okay.
So trigger warnings do increase anxiety in students too. And do you want to do that? Because the more you produce anxiety in a person before you start to try to teach them, the less they're going to learn.
Right. They're not focusing on what you're telling them.
No, they've been hijacked in their brain. We did a show on the amygdala hijack, and that's exactly what happens of this. And earlier studies even back this up, concluding the more attention that you actually place on bad feelings, or a lot of what we hear in our culture today, victimization, the more you attend to that, the worse people feel. And I think we can see that. And this could be one of the reasons why anxiety has increased so much in our culture. In other words, these warnings can reinforce victimhood and make students feel worse as they focus on those negative feelings.
So our point of all of this is that feelings are really not a good guide to behavior. And the more we reinforce someone as a victim, the more they're going to actually feel worse.
Yeah, and I really I want to say we should be, empathetic to the life experiences of our students. And we don't want to prime people, though, to feel bad. That's one of the issues that's involved in this that you really don't hear about when these conversations go on.
So the more we focus on unhappiness, the worse we feel.
Which goes back to the beginning of our show, right? To keep checking on a child's happiness is not really helpful. I mean, just look around you on the subway or the bus or the people in the mall. They don't look particularly happy all the time.
No.
In fact, many of us, when we're out in public, we don't look happy either. And if we keep checking that unhappiness and focusing on it, it's just not helpful.
Right. There are so many studies, I'm sure, that agree with that. I know for sure that they show that the more we value happiness, the less happy we are.
And one of those studies was published in the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology. And it found that the more teens agreed with the statement, even when I feel happy, I still wish I could be happier.
Wow.
The more symptoms of depression they had.
And there are more problems with asking kids over and over how they feel. One of those has to do with how children, teens, and young adults approach a task. And you tell us that there are two basic approaches for this.
There's one called an action orientation, and that's when you focus on a task without getting distracted by thoughts about your emotional or physical state because you're so focused on the task. And the other one is called a state orientation, where you think more about what's going on in yourself in the moment, how prepared you feel, an email you forgot to send. But the more action-oriented you are, the better you do and you accomplish the task.
Oh, that makes sense to me. I don't think a basketball coach is going to go into halftime and say, hey, guys, how you feeling? We're down by 20. He's going to tell them how to get back and win.
Yeah, exactly. And the studies show that those who fixate on how they feel in the moment are less likely to complete the task. They struggle with self-control. You need to put upsetting thoughts out of your head sometimes to accomplish things.
I've got it. So we're not doing anybody a favor by constantly asking them how they feel in the moment.
We need to tell them that their feelings are not always reliable. Sometimes feelings just need to be ignored, and you need to focus on learning or doing a task.
I wonder if people may think we're sounding insensitive, but it seems to me that what we're trying to do is be concerned about other people, and that's empathy, and that's a good thing.
Yes, and we want to be empathetic. Our point is that an overfocus, we're talking about an overfocus, isn't helpful.
Okay, well, we're just getting started, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to take a short break, and then when we return, more on the role of feelings in healthy living. I'll be right back on the Dr. Linda Mintle Show.
Dr. Linda, one of our listeners asked this question. Sometimes I'm so overcome with worry and anxiety that I think I'm losing my mind. Seems I've tried everything from drugs to meditation. Why doesn't anything work?
Well, I'm so sorry that your life seems so unmanageable and overwhelming. Too often, though, it does seem nearly impossible to live in peace and contentment because of all the craziness in our world. Did you know that God's plan for handling worry is so simple and yet so perfect that you can begin using it today? Did you know that starting right now, you can begin to cultivate a worry-free life? These aren't pie-in-the-sky promises. They're God's prescription for you to thrive and to soar past your anxiety and worries. Try this. The next time you begin to feel overwhelmed by life's pressures and worry clouds your mind with negative thoughts and depression, say what King David prayed. The Lord is my strength and my shield. Remind yourself that my heart trusts in Him and I am helped. I have so much more good news for you. I hope you'll find it in my book, Letting Go of Worry.
It's available wherever you buy your books online.
Welcome back to the Dr. Linda Mintle Show. Our topic today is Stop Asking Me How I Feel. We have a lot of more information to talk about on that. But before we do, I want to remind you to check out Dr. Linda's website, drlindamintle.com. There you're going to find her blogs, her books. You can connect with her on social media. And of course, listen to our podcast anytime on your favorite podcast platform, or you can go to myfaithradio.com. Okay, so Dr. Linda, we've been talking about not obsessing over how our children, our teens, our young adults feel from moment to moment.
Yeah, and our concern, I'm going to say it again, is this constant focus on feelings and how that teaches our children and even teens, young adults, anyone really in our life to overfocus and overvalue those feelings and those emotions that come up. Instead, really with children especially, and I guess adults too, we want to set goals and we want to be able to take risks, right?
I think so. I think this makes a lot of sense. So if you are ready for this, I'd like to take this to a more spiritual conversation and see how this overfocus on emotion lines up with God's word. Clearly, God gave people tasks to do, and they had to overcome their emotions to do them, right?
So I'm thinking about Moses, Norm.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he had a lot to deal with and lots of difficulty when he was called to lead those people.
Right. In the second chapter of Exodus, one of the Hebrew slaves was giving Moses a hard time, and he said, well, who made you ruler and judge over us? Basically, who died and made you the boss, right?
Right.
We know emotions got the best of Moses because he commits murder. And then he becomes a fugitive from Egypt and spends his next 40 years out in the desert as a shepherd. From Prince of Egypt to a desert nobody, Moses paid a very high price for letting his emotions dictate his behavior.
Yeah, and there's several stories here we could talk about in Moses' life. There was the story of the burning bush, where Moses is commissioned by God to lead the Hebrews into the promised land. And what does he feel at that moment? He feels fearful, he feels inadequate, and he's stubbornly reluctant to assume that task.
Well, that's a great example. Let's try to grasp this scene. Here's God calling him to do a great work, miraculously, but he's focused on his own negative self-perception. Let's be fair now. Moses doesn't really know who this God is. So the Almighty, by introducing himself and promising to be with him, is a brand new thought for him. Nonetheless, Moses realistically worries, well, why are people going to listen to me? Who am I? So despite the encounter, miraculous as it was, Moses focuses instead on his own fears and insecurities.
You know, and while God gives him the power to do miracles and more, Moses has to really step up, right, and do the job and not be derailed by those feelings. All this insecurity, self-doubt, fear could have derailed him right there at multiple points during his, I was going to say his career, but in his life, right? So he has to really try to stay focused on the tasks that he's been given by God.
Then later in the same book, Numbers 20, we read the story of how a very frustrated Moses was with the stubborn people he had led out of Egypt, and they were now just about to enter the promised land. So a month or so into this, they could have made the trip easily and quickly. They needed water. They were complaining. Again, they complained a lot. And Moses was instructed by God to speak to a rock to get water to come out of it. Now, remember, it was this exact same scenario earlier when God instructed Moses to hit a rock with his staff, his rod. But this time, instead of obeying God's directive to speak to the rock, Moses was so angry and so frustrated, there are his feelings again, he hit the rock like he did the first time. And not just once, but this time he hit it twice. He was doubly frustrated. So his feelings in that moment got the best of him, and as we know, as a result, God would not allow him to enter the promised land.
You know, that story just always seems harsh to me.
I know.
I mean, I know he's not being obedient to what God told him to do, right? And when we're disobedient, a lot of times our emotions do get the best of us. And then we regret what we do when we don't regulate them.
Right. And because Moses was at that point governed by his anger, he couldn't see clearly enough to obey and trust God instead.
Yeah, so how many times, have we said or done things out of anger? Have we gone our own way and then wished that we hadn't done that? When God wants us to really regulate our emotions when he calls us to do things, even though they might be scary.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you won't feel things, right? It doesn't mean that you're not going to feel maybe a little anxious or that fear. But in keeping with what we know from Scripture, it means that emotions should not rule your actions.
Right. And as we talked about in the first part of our program today, these emotions are fleeting and they change and they're not reliable to base behavior upon. I think that's probably what you're saying, right?
Well, and they will derail a lot of times the work that God has us to do.
Well, in the New Testament, Paul mentions in the book of Galatians, when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, that one of those fruits is self-control.
Yeah, and self-control is really about submission to God and controlling your emotions. It means being directed by the Holy Spirit so you don't just act on rash emotions. I mean, that's something we all have to work on, I think. But like Moses, we all have to balance our emotions with allowing God to be in control through his Holy Spirit.
Right. And Jesus, our great example, is another great example with his own emotions and self-control. He was patient with his disciples, as frustrating as they were from time to time.
They must have been really frustrating.
Well, there are
He
several
was
times.
God, too.
Well, several times he goes, "Really?
Yeah.
Do I have to explain this
Yes.
again?"
Again, why aren't you getting this? Yeah. Yeah.
He was very gentle and forgiving with the Samaritan woman at the well. And while he famously did get angry at the money changers in the temple, he didn't direct his anger to them personally. In fact, later, he was kind and gentle, even with Judas, who he knew was just about to betray him.
Yeah, that's a good distinction that he didn't direct it to the actual people. And during his trial and his crucifixion, I mean, you just have to look at that and go, what self-control Jesus absolutely exercised during that time. And so we need this fruit of the Spirit, self-control in our lives, especially with how reactive our culture has become with emotions. It's so easy to get caught up in all of that and to lash out at others and not regulate our emotions.
I'm glad you mentioned that as part of our current culture, because I hear so often, and I know you do, a sentence that begins with, "Well, I feel like," or "I feel that." And I know it's become a cliche way to begin a sentence for a lot of people. Instead, we probably used to say, "Well, in my opinion," or "I think," but now it's "I feel." And there's such a, not even intentional, just this deeply held sense that my feelings are what I base
Matter.
everything on, and
Yeah.
that's what matters.
Yeah, and I think about this, I'll present something that's very factual to medical students. And then I'll get a comment, "Well, I don't feel that that's right." I remember once when I was giving them the law about how you have a duty to warn when a patient is homicidal. And one of the students said, "Well, I don't feel like that's right." I was like, "Well, it's the law. So regardless of what you feel, you have to do it or you're going to be in trouble." So that just shows you the degree that this is seeped into the way people think and the way we approach things, which can be very dangerous.
We ought to do a program sometime about how culture absorbs these ideas and then just become universal.
Right.
Because this one has become universal.
And we have to question it. Is it a good thing or not?
And God urges us to consider our thoughts rather than just feelings. Philippians 4:8, for example, says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent and praiseworthy, think about such things."
Boy, that scripture can be very convicting because it reminds us not to spend a whole lot of time on ruminating on negative thoughts and emotions. Like if we're constantly thinking that we're not happy all the time. So let's go full circle back to the beginning of our show, right? That this overemphasis on feeling happy, I have to be happy all the time. If we constantly are in that mode and happiness is our goal, that's really not the goal for the Christian. I mean, I know it's the goal of the culture, right?
Right.
So everything is geared towards what makes you happy, what would make you happy, even though it doesn't really fit the Christian way of thinking.
Right. Well, we need to be honest here. Let me just, in full disclosure to the Americans who are listening to us, the quote, "pursuit of happiness,"
Oh, yeah.
is in the opening sentence of our Constitution.
Yeah.
It's one of the quote unquote self-evident truths that God intends for us. But is it really? Here, you know what I'm saying. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Right. So, but Aquinas said it is impossible for any created good to constitute man's happiness. For happiness is that perfect good which entirely satisfies one's desire. This is to be found not in any creature, but in God alone, because every creature has only participated in goodness. Therefore, God alone can satisfy the will of man according to the words of the psalmist, who alone satisfies your desire with good things. Therefore, God alone constitutes man's happiness.
Wow, that's really, really good. So we need to remember that only a perfect God can bring true happiness. So to close out our time together, remember that an overfocus on happiness and feelings does not make for resilient people, nor does it help us face life difficulties and keep us moving forward. Acknowledge your feelings, be aware of them, but certainly don't let them rule you, and be about what God has called you to do. That's all the time we have today. Many thanks to my co-host, Norm Mintle, who makes this show a conversation, and to our technical producer, Katie Sims. From all of us here at Faith Radio, hey, we'll talk to you again next weekend. In the meantime, remember, we're doing life together, and it's better when you don't have to do it alone.
Doing life together.
Hey, thanks for listening to this conversation from the Dr. Linda Mintle Show. These conversations are available because of your support. Become a supporter now at myfaithradio.com. Please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes, and share it with friends so we can live life to the fullest, walk confidently, and find healing and hope.